Oh boy, this is gonna be a tough one for me. What's up, everybody? Ryan Thomas of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. This subject matter is complicated. It is tricky. It is tough. Chael Sonnen's legacy. Chael Sonnen decided to call it a career after Bellator 222, where he fought in the co-main event, the co-featured main event, as Bellator likes to put it. But co-main event versus Lyoto Machida. And Lyoto Machida has oftentimes been referred to as the Rubik's Cube of MMA. Very tough fight for anyone. And for Chael Sonnen to add Lyoto Machida's name to his resume, whether it was via victory or defeat, just the fact that Chael Sonnen fought him, I think adds another name to his resume as far as guys that he's fought. He's fought virtually everyone inside the sport within his era at three different weight classes. So I think that is the first feather and a very important feather in his cap, because oftentimes we do have guys that want to stay within one weight class. Even one of the greatest, arguably the greatest ever, John Jones, has decided that he's going to stay at light heavyweight. He hasn't said that he's not going to move up to the heavyweight division yet inside the UFC, but there hasn't really been any traction towards that idea yet. He hasn't really come out and set forth a game plan as to whether or not he would fight in the heavyweight division. If you were to tell me, 2-3 years ago, 4 years ago, that Chael Sonnen, who was then retired, would come back and fight Fedor Emelianenko at heavyweight, would I have been surprised? And the answer is no, because Chael Sonnen fought anyone and everyone inside the sport of MMA within his era at middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight. The only man to ever fight John Jones, Anderson Silva, and Fedor Emelianenko. And those were 4 fights of his career, being that he fought Anderson twice, John Jones once, and Fedor once. And yeah, he did go 0 for 4. Most guys would. Most guys would go 0 for 4 under those circumstances. And not many would fight those guys. Actually, none of the other fighters would fight those guys but Chael Sonnen. So that's the first thing that I really want to let be known on this edition of the Thomas Take Sports Podcast. Tuesday here, June 18th, 2019. Chael Sonnen, after his fight with Lyoto Machida, which was a second-round TKO defeat, he decided to hang him up, and it was a scene that was very emotional for him. You could tell that he was choked up a little bit. He didn't really want to say goodbye, but it was time for him to say goodbye. Thanks for the memories. I'm walking out. Goodbye. Those are the exact words that he said, and I thought that it was a really just it was a moment in MMA that I don't think I quite understood the magnitude of that moment within the sport. And oftentimes when I see these guys decide to retire, it is a little bit, it is a little bit emotional for me as an MMA fan, because I've followed this sport for so long, and as a fan, and then writing, and then starting this podcast covering the sport, seeing these guys retire one by one, it lets me know that my era is aging. It is past, and that sucks. That's sad. Granted, these guys are far older than me, but when I started watching the sport, the guys that really came to mind: Rashad Evans, George St. Pierre, Chael Sonnen, Anderson Silva. Those were guys that I looked at and looked at as big names within the sport. All of them are pretty much retired. Anderson is not retired yet, but I think eventually he will be very, very soon. Arguably should be already. But who are we to tell a man when his time is up? That's another facet of this whole retirement situation, is who are we to tell a fighter when his time is up? Who are we to say time's up? You don't need to be fighting. You need to retire. You need to go. It's time for you to go. that's a dynamic that I think needs to be thrown out there, and I think that that's a dynamic that has to be said. That hey, these fighters need to retire on their own merit, at their own pace, at their own time, and go at that route. Go at that pace. Go when you feel like your time is up. When you fought your last fight and you fought to your last breath, that's when it's time to go. And I think Chael Sonnen did that. I think his legacy is really complicated, and there's a guy out there that I respect greatly for his writing career. His name's Kevin Iole, and he wrote an article for Yahoo Sports that said that Chael Sonnen was one of the biggest drug cheats of his time. And I think that while on one hand I could agree with that and say that that's true, given the moment that he cheated, the moment, the fight, the magnitude of the fight, the way he performed in that fight, had he won that title off of Anderson Silva back at UFC 117 back in 2010, and then tested positive for the performance-enhancing drugs, the 5 different performance-enhancing drugs that he tested positive for, that would have been really bad for the sport at that time. It would have left a real stain on the sport at that time. But then again, as Chael Sonnen has said so poignantly many of times before, we're talking about a sport where 2 people get into a locked cage and fight with shorts on. It's very, very tough to say that this sport is, the cleanest of sports, and consider it like baseball or talk about it in the same narrative as baseball. But being that the sport is so worldwide and that the sport, the UFC as a fight league, as an organization, is synonymous with the NFL, the NHL, NBA, you have to have, some taste within the matter and throw things out there into context to provide different narratives for fans to gravitate to. And that's really all that was. And I think that as much as I appreciate every writer and the angles that they come at, I will say that Chael Sonnen was not the only drug cheat of his era. I don't think there's an amount specific to the amount of drug cheats that were within that era of mixed martial arts. There were a lot of drug cheats. All of them were drug cheats at that time. Does that make it right that Chael Sonnen tested positive? No, it does not. But we have to state the facts while stating the facts. It's a fact that Chael Sonnen did test positive for 5 different drugs, and it's a fact that everybody else was testing positive. It's just that Chael Sonnen at that time, at that particular time, was the most famous fighter outside of any of the champions. He was the most famous non-champion fighter in the sport. So when he tested positive, it became a let's see what we can do to put this name out there and let it be known that other guys are going to test positive too. And it was almost as if, I don't want to say Chael Sonnen was made an example of, because then that would insinuate that what he did wasn't wrong. It was wrong. But I look at it the same stance that I have with professional baseball. It was the sport's fault for the fact that they allowed this to happen inside the sport. It was the sport's fault, not the fighters. The fighters only worked with the rules that they were given. And granted, a fighter is going to bend every rule in order to maintain a competitive edge against his opponent. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's literally, you're putting your life on the line, stepping into that octagon or that ring. You leave that octagon, you leave that ring a lesser version of yourself every time you enter it. So, I really don't hold anything against Chael Sonnen for that. I look at that time and say I was very disappointed as a fan, just due to the fact that I wanted to see Chael Sonnen fight. It took 2 years of his career that I think were very crucial years in his career. I believe he was 33 when he first fought Anderson Silva, 35. when he fought him again, if memory serves me right. So those are very crucial years in his career, and he was suspended again for that. And really, that's why his fight with Wanderlei Silva was delayed for so long, was due to the drug testing stuff that went on. So it's very tough because they did not have the drug testing policies that they have in effect now. Back when Chael Sonnen was fighting, they're really only kicking the tires on the idea. And then once Chael Sonnen popped, someone of his fame, someone of his magnitude, that's when they really decided, okay, we really have to hunker down on this. Johnny Hendricks was also another guy that it was long rumored that he had stuff in his system. So, excuse me, I can't say that I hold much against Chael Sonnen for that, being that in general I don't really care about that stuff. And second off, it was the sport's fault. So let's just nip that issue in the bud right now. As far as people saying, you're a fan of a drug cheat, a guy that, did the drugs and did. Half the people don't even know what he tested positive for. Half the people don't even know why he took it. Half the people don't even know anything about MMA. So that's kind of how I see it. To say that he was the greatest drug cheat ever, I would say he was the best drug cheat at that time, being that the results actually spoke for themselves, and he even tweeted as such earlier today on his Twitter at SonnenCH. And I think that Chael Sonnen will always be known to me as a character that I look at the history of the sport. We look at this current climate. If you want to talk about the current climate of the sport, the state of MMA, and allow me briefly to touch on this, we are in the entertainment era. We are in an era where fighters have to hype up the fights in order to get people to tune in. That's just the era that we're in. Chael Sonnen kind of gave us the appetizer, and Conor McGregor was the main course of that. We'll find out who the dessert is going to be eventually. But I would kind of put it in those terms. Chael Sonnen kind of seized our appetites a little bit, and then Conor McGregor was the main course, and we'll find out who the dessert's going to be, as far as a guy that comes in and galvanizes the sport, becomes a polarizing figure in the sport. That's what Chael Sonnen was. That's what Conor McGregor is, and that's what someone else will be as well eventually as the years go by. I'd like to say that there's going to be 3 guys to come along that will do that. Maybe Colby Covington is the other one. Only time will tell. But I'd say as far as the narrative that Chael created, really ushered in a new era of guys that felt the need to talk the talk, walk the walk, make the walk, fight their fight, win, lose, or draw. They showed up, they promoted, they hyped up the fight, and that's how it's supposed to be. That's what's supposed to happen. You're supposed to have fighters that are willing to sell, willing to push the fights, willing to push the agenda of the UFC, and that's what Chael Sonnen was willing to do for those few years that he was around, and it was a real meteoric rise, just like Conor McGregor. There's a lot of similarities between Chael Sonnen and Conor McGregor's career. Chael Sonnen was looked at as just this wrestler that fought a very boring style, Team Quest guy that trained with Randy Couture. Greco-Roman was his specialty. Trained with Matt Lindland. You're really going back to the early, late 90s as far as Chael Sonnen's lineage into the sport, and he really didn't get his opportunity until 2010. I mean, that shows you right there the journey that Chael Sonnen had as an MMA fighter to not really get your UFC title shot for 10 years. You put pedal to the metal and really had to earn that shot. And I look at Chael Sonnen's career, and that's what I see. I see a guy that went out there and earned it on his own terms. Everything was on his own terms. He walked the walk, he talked the talk, and his career started in 1997. MMA wasn't even a thing in 1990. I mean, MMA was a thing, but 1997. And for him to become a top challenger at middleweight and to become a top challenger at light heavyweight, a lot of people looked at that as, the light heavyweight title shot as a little bit of a joke that he was given that title shot versus Jon Jones, but there was a real reason why he got that shot. He could sell the fights, and he could also put out a narrative that he actually deserved the fight. And back at, I believe it was UFC 151, which if you go back and you look at the archives of the sport, Chael Sonnen fought Anderson Silva in his rematch at UFC 148. UFC 151, Jon Jones was set to fight Dan Henderson. Huge fight. Dan Henderson, more than deserving of that title shot, being that he was a Strikeforce champ back in the UFC, looking to get a title belt. UFC 151, the stage was set, about 72 hours, maybe even less than that, before the fight took place. It was more than that. It was about 6 days. 6 days out. Dan Henderson blows out his knee, completely tears it. And Chael Sonnen waves his hand in the air. He gets a call from Dana White. Dana White calls 5 fighters, 4 of which declined to step in on short notice to fight Jon Jones. One of which said, I will fight Jon Jones tonight if I have to. I will fly to Vegas, fly wherever I got to fly to, and fight Jon Jones tonight. I want that title opportunity. I want that shot. And that was a huge story. What was an even bigger story is the fact that Jon Jones said no. The champion denied the challenger that was fighting on short notice. Jon Jones said, no, I will not fight Chael Sonnen on short notice. The card got canceled. The card was completely canceled due to the fact that UFC could not put a main event together in that short of notice. And that was why Chael Sonnen got that title shot. He was the only guy at that very moment that was willing to fight Jon Jones that night, not 6 days later, that night. And I think that that's really honorable. I think that that is a microcosm of who Chael Sonnen was. And, the most high-profile fight, without a doubt, the one that comes to mind immediately when I hear the name Chael Sonnen is his first fight with Anderson Silva at UFC 117, where he talked, you want to talk about one of the fights that really, I think, put the UFC on the map. UFC 117, Anderson Silva versus Chael Sonnen will be a fight that I might actually, as I set up my studio here, I might actually get that fight poster on my wall. That's a fight poster that I think every UFC fan should have, because that's a fight that really was a legendary moment in the sport. Anderson Silva had not lost a round in the UFC, had not lost a fight in the UFC, was unblemished, 11-0. And here you have this guy that had double-digit losses, 12, 13 losses in the loss column in his career, 28, 29 victories. A guy that had 2 separate runs inside the UFC. The first initial run for Chael Sonnen went pretty horrible, did not go well. He gets cut, bounces around the world, fights in the WEC, fights Paulo Filho for the middleweight title, loses, gets a rematch, and Paulo Filho misses weight by 4 pounds, which made the title fight a non-title fight. Chael Sonnen wins that fight, does not get the belt from the WEC, but Paulo Filho, in a real grand gesture, mails the title to Chael Sonnen, and he still has that on his wall to this day, that WEC middleweight title. So Chael Sonnen, the uncrowned WEC middleweight champion, always will be. He gets this title fight with Anderson Silva and had to, again, go through the grinder to do it. He had to go through Nate Marquardt, Yushin Okami, Jim Miller. Those were 3 very tough middleweights at that time in the UFC. Yushin Okami was always looked at as a possible number 1 contender, eventually became the number 1 contender. Nate Marquardt was a number one contender, stepped into the octagon with Anderson Silva, and was looked at as this, real tough force, a very muscular, physical specimen at middleweight. And Dan Miller, brother of Jim Miller, you know those brothers. Those guys are tough guys as well. And Chael Sonnen ran through all of them to get to Anderson Silva the first time. And I knew how that fight was going to play out. I remember the time leading up to that fight thinking that Anderson Silva has been taken down before. Chael Sonnen takes guys down in the UFC better than anybody. Anderson is going to get taken down. Whether he gets back to his feet remains to be seen, but Anderson is going to get taken down. He got taken down and then some. And watching that fight play itself out, those first 4 rounds, I marveled at what I was seeing. I was astonished by what I was seeing. I will never forget watching that fight in my buddy, shout out to Tom Frew, his living room, with another buddy of mine, Mike Costello, and we were just going crazy. We were losing our minds. The fact that Chael was winning that fight, pillar to post, destroying Anderson Silva, taking him down at will, pounding his face in, just maintaining top position. And I watched that fight then, and that's what I saw. That's what I saw in my mind. I watched that fight. I saw that. But I watched it on UFC Fight Pass yesterday, and I saw Chael Sonnen take Anderson down at will. I saw Chael Sonnen punch Anderson Silva, but some of those punches were not the hardest of punches in the world, but the pressure that he put on Anderson Silva, he was breaking him. And with 1 minute, 50 seconds left, Anderson Silva throws out a triangle and was able to get Chael Sonnen's arm and his leg to a degree in that position and win that fight. You can literally say that Chael Sonnen was the closest that any fighter has ever been to winning a UFC title and not winning it. I couldn't imagine a world where Anderson Silva lost that fight and Chael Sonnen won that fight. The mayhem that would have ensued that night in Oakland, California, at the Oracle Arena at UFC 117 would have been one of the most memorable moments in sports history. And I really wish it would have happened. I won't lie. I am a fan of this gentleman. I am a fan of Chael Sonnen. I always have been. I always will be. And I really wish that would have happened that night. It would have been a great moment in the sport of MMA. But it also, as I alluded to earlier, it would have concluded with a dark moment in the sport because Chael Sonnen would have tested positive. He probably would have been stripped of the title, and it would have created a huge mess. So in that regard, I am thankful that, that he didn't win that fight, but I would have just loved to see that moment of him getting that UFC belt wrapped around his waist, which is something I felt like he really deserved and really went through the ringer to earn that. But it wasn't meant to be. It was Anderson Silva's comeback moment. And really, that was Anderson Silva's arrival, because although he was 11-0, although he was knocking everybody out, he needed that dance partner to promote him. He needed that dance partner to sell his fight, because Anderson Silva was not much of a draw. And I know that sounds crazy because Anderson Silva is one of the best fighters ever, but he was not a draw. Did not speak English real well, did not really want to try to, due to the fact that he spoke mainly Portuguese, and he had his manager with him, Ed Soares, 100% of the time to translate his Portuguese anyway. Plus the fact that he was knocking out pretty much everybody. So there was not really much of a draw there in terms of the mouth on Anderson Silva. There wasn't really a lot of drawing power there. So he needed a dance partner that was going to talk the talk, walk the walk, and do those things. And I think without Chael Sonnen, I don't know if Anderson Silva would even be looked at in the same light as he is now. I don't know if Anderson Silva would be as famous as he is now if he had not fought Chael Sonnen. He needed Chael Sonnen. He needed the foe. He needed the rival, and he got it. And I think that was really a moment in time that I think MMA history, UFC history, that was a great moment in time. That was probably my favorite time being a UFC fan. I'm dating myself back, but it was 2010. It was the summer of my senior year. What was the year I actually graduated from high school. And it was one of the best years of my life, to be quite honest. It was a lot of fun being outside with my friends and watching those glory days of the UFC. That was great, and as you get older, you don't see those same friends. You don't watch those same fights. And, that's something that I think helps me remember those times, is fights like that. Fights like Anderson Silva, Chael Sonnen. And the rematch, I thought that was the best Chael Sonnen against Anderson Silva that there might ever be. I hoped I was wrong. I wanted to see Chael Sonnen do what he did again. Could he do it? Could he do it again? Unfortunately, he could not. Excuse me. Unfortunately, he could not. And that was a night that also really sucked, because I thought that fight was unjustly stopped. I've always said that. Thought the knee that Anderson threw to Chael was an illegal one, and Yves Levine, who was the ref of that fight, should have intervened and paused the action, but he didn't, and that was a real shame. That might be why Chael actually got that title shot against John Jones, is because that ending to the Anderson Silva rematch was just not ideal for all those years of build-up, for the 5 years that 7 years of build-up for that fight, for the first fight plus the second one. I didn't think that was right. Chael Sonnen will always be remembered. I think his mark on the sport is massive. I think he's one of the guys that everybody should be thinking of when they think of entertainment and MMA. I think Chael Sonnen is the first name that pops up in terms of the history of the sport. Conor McGregor would be the second, and throw in Michael Bisping's name in there as well. Throw in Brock Lesnar's name in there as well. Throw in Ronda Rousey's name in there as well, in terms of the entertainment factor that they brought to the sport as being a draw, talking the talk, walking the walk. For a time, Ronda Rousey did that as well. So that's just how I see it. And, I have to thank Chael Sonnen, because without him, I don't know where I would be in terms of my fandom of the sport. I don't know where I'd be in terms of what avenue I went down professionally. He dictated a lot for a lot of people inside the MMA media, inside combat sports. I looked at the sport as a fan at that time, and really when he burst onto the scene, he was somebody that I looked at and said, wow, he's really making this sport great. This is a sport that I would love to cover, would love to talk about, would love to write about, because of him. And because of him, because of George St. Pierre, BJ Penn, there's a lot of guys from that era that contributed to putting MMA and the UFC where it is. And then, I also have to throw this in there. The fact that he helped build Bellator tremendously well. He really helped Bellator become a bigger brand. And I think that is a facet of his career that he should be very proud of, because him going to Bellator was really out of left field. I did not see that coming. I remember reading the headline that he was fighting Tito Ortiz in Bellator, and I was like, oh my God, thank you, Jesus. He's back. The American Gangster is back. He's fighting Huntington Beach Bad Boy, the bad guy versus the bad boy. That was a great, you want to talk about the build-up to that fight? That was one of the best build-ups to any MMA fight. You can talk about Tito being past his prime. You can talk about Chael being past his prime. Bullshit. That fight was a great fight heading in. The pre-fight hype was great. The fight was great too. There was nothing wrong with that. It ended a little bit controversially, but it was fun. And he provided us with a lot of fun matchups. I look at his fight record right now. I go on, the sites here, and I look at his fight record. I look at who he fought. I mean, after he had fought Anderson Silva, or before he had fought Anderson Silva, he fought Damian Maia, fought Dan Miller, he fought Yushin Okami, he fought Nate Marquardt, fought Anderson Silva twice, Brian Stann, Michael Bisping. He had to go through Brian Stann and Michael Bisping in order to get back to Anderson Silva. I mean, those were two very tough guys. Those were two. One of them became an eventual champion. One of them was a champion in the WEC and Stann. Then to fight Anderson Silva again and lose. Then fight John Jones. Then fight Shogun and win. Rashad Evans, Tito Ortiz, Vanderlei Silva, Quentin Rampage Jackson, Fedor Emelianenko, and Lyoto Machida. I mean, those were really, those are some massive names in the sport. He fought the who's who. I mean, that says a lot to me. The fact that he was able to fight the quote-unquote who's who in MMA. I really look forward to watching his career explode, post his fighting career, because I think he's a guy that could potentially be one of these fighters that has one of the most successful post-fight careers that you could ever have. Chael Sonnen is not done in MMA. He's going to really be one of the bigger media members of the sport. His podcast is one of the most successful in the world, let alone for MMA. And I think that, his brand as Chael Sonnen is bigger than it's ever been, which says a lot. And, I threw out a status yesterday. There was news that Dana White signed a 10-year deal to remain the UFC president, the president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. And I'm happy for Dana. I think Dana has done great things in this sport. There's moments where he rubs me the wrong way a little bit, but I think anybody could say that, where he might say some things that I scratch my head and I'm like, what the hell is he talking about? But all that aside, no commissioner or president or overseer of a sports league has done more for their sport within the last 20 years than Dana White has. That's fact. It's not opinion. That's fact. Do the research and you'll see for yourselves. But I think after these 10 years are up, I think Dana's done. I think he'll be done with the UFC at that point. He wants to get back in business with the Fertittas. The Fertittas are looking to buy the Denver Broncos or the Los Angeles Chargers. And Dana, I think, wants to work with those guys again. He misses those guys. And as much as he loves working with Ari Emanuel of WME-IMG, I think there's a guy that would like working with him a lot too, and that is Chael Sonnen. I think he'd be perfect as the president of the Ultimate Fighting Championship. Nobody understands the business of fighting, of combat sports, like Chael Sonnen does outside of Dana White. I think there would be a really unique transition where the entertainment era of the UFC would explode more than it already has if Chael Sonnen was the promoter, president of the UFC. So let's chew on that for a little bit. Chael Sonnen, thank you for so many memories, so many great memories. Your interview with Ariya Helwani, the black and white interview where you said that the Nogueira brothers thought the bus was a horse and they were trying to feed a carrot to the bus. Putting the carrot in the grill of the bus was one of the funniest interviews at that time. I remember watching that on my iPhone 4 and just laughing my ass off and thinking, this guy is a goddamn genius. And I really appreciate everything that he's done for the sport, everything he will continue to do for the sport. He's done a lot for the sport of MMA, and I think he is a Hall of Famer. I think he you cannot talk about baseball without talking about David Ortiz. You cannot talk about baseball without talking about A-Rod. You cannot talk about MMA without talking about Chael Sonnen. You just can't do it. You cannot ignore these facts that everyone was doing it. Everyone was doing it. And we just acknowledge it and just say that that we're proud that era is over, and we recognize the people that fought in that era that put blood, sweat, and tears inside that octagon, inside that ring, on that diamond. That's how I see it. So I'm Ryan Thomas. That is my opinion on Chael Sonnen's legacy. What if I told you you didn't have to be a champion to be a champion? Chael Sonnen, a champion in my eyes. Chael Sonnen, a champion of the art of promotion. One of the best fighters in terms of selling a fight ever. And he was a pretty damn good fighter. So long, Chael. It was great to watch your career. Join the takeover, everybody, at Ryan Thomas Take on Twitter and Instagram as well. Feel free to subscribe to the Thomas Take Sports Podcast YouTube channel and like the Facebook page.